So for the next week or so, the 719cc Kubota diesel-powered Honda Insight will be off the road as we work on the supercharger installation. And as luck would have it, we're waiting on some parts once again. So I have about 2 days to kill, and I thought for the next 16 hours, let's play with our new project car. Oh, I reckon I should show you the new project car first. Okay, you're looking at it. That's right, this is not the 719cc Kubota diesel-powered, soon-to-be supercharged Honda Insight. Nope, it's just a regular Honda Insight. And to prove that, let's take a look under the hood. Yeah, it's a bit dirty and dusty. You see, this car has been off the road for at least 5 years, possibly longer. It's pretty much a non-runner, and as my ex-wife would say, it's a pig in a poke. We really don't know what's wrong with the car other than the high-pressure fuel lines, or FUBAR, and will require a replacement. But overall, the car looks complete under the hood, and that's good because these cars are packed full of outdated technology, so at the very least, the engine appears to be all there. Now, the seller was more than happy to include replacement fuel lines with the deal, and that's a huge bonus because as I understand it, the old ones are corroded to the point where they leak, and if that wasn't bad enough, an animal got under there and ate most of the plastic portions. I can't imagine that tasted good, but you never know unless you try, I guess. Now, fixing the fuel lines is kind of a walk in the park, and if that was the only issue, this car would have been repaired a long time ago. However, this car was also in the process of being restored, and all of these parts were removed. Most of this stuff is just furniture, and it's nothing more than a few nuts and bolts to put it back together. The real issue is this thing, and this is where it gets a bit sketchy. You see, this stuff is the hybrid battery pack and the electric motor drive system. Meh, I really don't care for the hybrid stuff on this car, because the car will actually run and drive without all this stuff. However, the computer in the car is expecting to see signals generated by this chunk of outdated technology, and in order to diagnose all the problems with the car, we have to put this stuff back in place. Now, if it works, that's great, but if it doesn't, we can spoof the computer with a clever hack that someone came up with, and with an Arduino and a few wires, we can make the computer happy again. But before we do that, it's probably best we get as much of the system working again. Oh, did I mention I know nothing about these cars? Yeah, I know, I do own one, but I took all this crap out years ago so I could put a lawnmower engine in my car. Anyway, overall this car is in excellent condition for its age, and as I recall, the seller indicated it had 250,000 miles on it. And the cool part about these cars is it's made almost entirely out of aluminum, so rust is not an issue whatsoever, except on the steel parts like the fuel lines, the brake lines, and some of the suspension parts. Anyway, that mountain of parts we just looked at resides in this area, so it's going to be a bit awkward to lift those parts into place and get them back into position. I reckon we'll cross that bridge when we get there. So the goal is to get this car running and driving again in the next 16 hours. I'm not sure that's even possible, but that's all the time I have, and after that the parts for the diesel Honda will have arrived, and this car will have to go on the back burner. Oh, speaking about the back burner, some folks asked about the status of the 670cc Predator-powered V-twin 1969 Renault R10. Well, that project is still alive and well, but due to the colder weather and the lack of a heater in the car, it's been put on the back burner as well. So back to the Honda. The good news is there's an access hole in the floor so we can work on the fuel lines. Now, it ain't a lot of space, but hopefully it'll be enough. As I recall, these wires provide power to the hybrid drive system, and when the engine is running, the electric motor is also used as a generator, and these wires will have voltage on them. How much voltage? I'm not sure, but before we get the engine running, I reckon I should separate the wires to avoid shorting stuff out. Okay, fast forward a bit and the car is off the ground so we can work on the fuel lines. Now, inside the car, I removed the stuff that was covering the hole for the fuel pump, and I discovered the fuel smelled a bit rancid. Meh, the lighting is bad, but if you could see and smell the gasoline, you'd be somewhat alarmed. Off camera, I did get a sample of the fuel, and as you can see, it's dark and it's stinky, but I've certainly smelled worse. Let's check this fuel out and see if it's any good. Yeah, the coloring is a lot darker than what I'm used to seeing. However, there aren't any floaters in the fuel. Let's see if this stuff will even burn. So I'm going to pour a small sample of the fuel in this modified Coke can, and I think you can guess the rest. Okay, so apparently it's difficult to operate a lighter with gloves on. Oh, there we go. Yeah, this gasoline should have ignited instantly, but this stuff really doesn't want to burn. Okay, now it's on fire. Uh-oh, this may have been a bad idea. Alright, the situation's been resolved. Anyway, I'm thinking the fuel is no good and we'll have to pump the tank out. So the good news is, this car has a plastic fuel tank, so no issues with rust. Also, the seller's already rebuilt the fuel pump and put a new filter on it, so at the very least, we don't have to worry about the condition of the fuel pump. It's already been rebuilt and tested. Fast forward a bit, and after looking under the car, I found where the fuel lines were possibly leaking. I went ahead and cut the bad sections out so we can look at them. So right here is where the steel line transitions into the plastic line, and the steel is corroded to the point where it's causing the fuel to leak. Normally, this would have been a simple fix. However, the plastic fuel lines were also damaged when some animal ate it for lunch or dinner. It's hard to tell the exact time the meal was consumed, but I reckon it was tasty because whoever ate it, well, they ate a lot of it. Anyway, the rest of the fuel lines are in perfect condition, so I think splicing the section of good fuel line onto the original fuel lines is the quickest option. Otherwise, I'll have to drop the fuel tank and the exhaust system and yada yada yada. I don't want to do any of that stuff. So I went ahead and prepped the replacement lines, and now all I have to do is snake them up into position, which is easier said than done. So in order to splice the new lines to the old lines, I need to use a small section of high-pressure fuel hose made for fuel injection systems. You know, high-pressure fuel hose ain't exotic, especially since fuel-injected cars have been around for the last 30 or more years. So I went to the auto parts store, which will remain nameless, but I'm sure the Irish folks in the crowd will know who I'm talking about. Anyway, the clerk behind the counter indicated that they don't sell high-pressure fuel hose and it would have to be ordered. So either the clerk was not aware of the products the store carries, or indeed this particular store didn't sell high-pressure fuel hose. Anyway, I went across the street and got the hose from their competitor. This is the second or third time I've had this type of experience with local parts stores. So fast forward a bit and the replacement fuel lines have been installed and the new and old lines have been spliced together. I'm thinking these clamps may be too big and I should probably look into getting smaller clamps, but they should work for now. The fuel pump's in place and I went ahead and separated these wires to avoid any surprises if we can get the engine running. I reckon the next step is to add some fresh gasoline to the tank, and I figure about 3.5 gallons should do the trick. Off camera, I went ahead and disconnect the fuel lines under the hood so we can purge the lines of any nasty fuel. Okay, let's connect the battery and see if this car will come alive. Well, that's a good sign. What I mean by that is no smoke and no fire. This car has the original key, so I don't have to worry about the immobilizer. Of course, that's if the immobilizer still works. And ignition. Okay, it looks like the fuel gauge is working. And we have a check engine light. Now that's important. You see, in order for the check engine light to work, the ECU that runs the engine has to trigger the light. So in other words, the ECU is alive and that's the first step. If we didn't get a check engine light, then we'd have to check the power going to the ECU and do all kinds of diagnostics. So far, everything is encouraging. Now, what I didn't hear is the fuel pump cycle. So when the ignition is first turned on, the fuel pump should run for a second or two, and we're not getting that at all. Fast forward a few minutes and I was able to locate the fuel pump relay, which plugs into this socket here. So this relay tests good on the bench, so that's not the problem. I also checked the main relay and that's working, so the problem is likely somewhere else. But that's no big deal. For now, I'm just going to jump this relay and that should get the fuel pump working. Okay, let me put a jumper across these pins and we can start flushing the fuel. Uh-oh, I may have spliced the fuel lines backwards. Meh, that will make this unique snowflake of a car even more unique. Let me swap this line over and we can try that again. Okay, now we're ready. Oh yeah, it's pumping. Now, this gas looks okay, but before I reconnect the fuel lines, I'm going to just connect the supply line and use that to push all the old fuel out of the injection rail. That way we'll have fresh gas in the fuel rail for our first start. Okay, let me run the pump again to clear out the fuel rail of the nasty gasoline. So I have about 6 hours into this job. Now I'm going to go have some lunch. And while I'm away, I'll let the fuel in the rail dissolve any crud that may be in there. And when I get back, I'll run the pump for another few seconds, and that should purge any additional crap out of the lines. I don't think this step is really necessary, but since I'm set up for it, why not? Off camera, I checked the oil and there was plenty of it, and it also looks like there's plenty of antifreeze. At this point, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't try starting the engine. This car actually has 2 starters. It uses the electric motor for the hybrid drive system as a starter, and the engine's also equipped with a conventional starter, or as it's also known as, the backup starter. So without the hybrid system in place, the computer should select the backup starter to crank the engine over. Let's see if that's true. And no dice. It would appear that there's something going on with the starter. Now, I did check the internets and they said sometimes you have to hold the key in the start position for a few seconds, and I also gave that a try, but no luck. The lack of a starter is a mere bump in the road because we got no time for that. So I went ahead and attached the Lone Wolf 2000 remote starter switch to bypass the computer. If this works, well, we'll look into the starter issues later. Oh boy, that was not expected. You know, the engine's a little noisy, but that is to be expected after sitting many years. The 5-speed manual transmission goes through all the gears without any issues, and the clutch feels really good. I think this car just may be worth saving. I'm doubtful the battery pack is any good, but hopefully we can get some of the hybrid stuff working again. You see, this car doesn't have a conventional alternator, and the only way to keep the 12-volt battery charged is with the DC converter that's built into the hybrid system. Just for giggles, let's see how much raw voltage this car generates. So for this measurement, I'm using the chassis as a ground reference, and I'm measuring AC voltage. And it looks like just over 27 volts AC when the engine's idling. I have no idea if that's good or bad. It is what it is. So far, I'm impressed. This 24-year-old Honda with a crazy amount of goofy crap disconnected seems to run fine. Of course, the check engine light's on, but that's to be expected. Well, we're making good progress, and I still have enough time to fill this equipment bay with all sorts of vintage electrical equipment. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I don't expect the hybrid system to work, and that's because the nickel metal hydride battery has perished a long time ago, but I would like to get the alternator to charge the 12-volt battery. And for that, we'll need to install all this stuff. Now, due to time constraints, I'm going to do all this stuff off camera, but from what I'm told, it's pretty much plug and play. And there we go. The system's totally installed and it was pretty easy to do. I reckon it took less than 2 hours to figure out. There's a lot of wires and connectors, but it's impossible to screw this up. Well, almost impossible. I still have a few loose parts, but this stuff should be okay flopping around on a bare piece of aluminum, so no worries. Okay, let's turn the battery on. I'm not sure what I was expecting, but nothing was always an option. Yeah, let's give it a few moments. Nope. I don't think it's going to do anything. Anyway, from some very basic research, I discovered this thingy is the DC to DC converter, and we need that to work if possible. It uses the 3-phase AC power that's being generated by the hybrid motor and converts it to 12 volts DC, and that's what keeps the 12-volt battery charged. This guy over here is the motor controller, and this is what applies voltage to the electric motor to help the car accelerate. And it's also what's used to start the gasoline engine when the car is fully functional. And of course, this chunky guy over here is the battery. I'm not sure, but I think it's something like 170 volts DC when it's fully charged. Okay, fast forward a bit and we have some good news. After letting the engine run for a short while, the computer sorted everything out, and now the DC to DC converter is working and the 12-volt battery is charging. Now, not that there's any contest, but I reckon this car has the biggest and most complex alternator Honda has ever made. Figure when you add up all the junk it takes to generate electricity, the alternator is close to 100 pounds and it has enough computing power to put a man on the moon. So just for giggles, let's see how much voltage is being sent to the hybrid battery. Wow, so at idle we're getting 157 volts. Once again, I have no idea if that's good. However, I do know when I shut the engine off, the voltage drops down to 4, and after a while it'll decay to 0. That's probably bad news for the hybrid battery. Aww. So I'm a bit concerned that the fuel pump still won't turn on when the car is started. Anyway, I went ahead and printed out a page from the manual so I could work through the problem. So this guy is the fuel pump, and we know it works because the engine will run if the relay is jumped. Now over here is the fuel pump relay, and we know that's good because we bench tested it. So over here is the main relay, and I've confirmed that this is working and switching power on and off. Up here are all the fuses, and off camera I pulled each fuse and checked them, and no problems were found. So the main relay and all the fuses are fine, so we can eliminate that as part of the problem. I also confirmed the fuel pump relay is getting power to the positive socket on the control side when the ignition's turned on. We know this wire is good because the fuel pump works when we jump it. And we know there's power to this lead because once again the fuel pump works when we jump it. So that leaves this line here, which seems to not be working, and this is a direct wire from the ECU. You see, in order for the fuel pump relay to turn on, the ECU needs to switch this line to ground, and that will send a command signal to the relay. Let's check the ECU and see if it's actually sending this command signal. Okay, we're all set up, and I'm back probing the command line for the relay, and this line should go to ground potential when the ignition is switched on. Well, actually, it should switch to ground for a second or two, and that's the fuel pump prime sequence.
DC 12.65 volt.
And when I switch the ignition on, sure enough, we are in fact getting the signal. That means the ECU is good and it's doing exactly what we want. Let's go back and check the fuel pump relay socket under the hood. So just so we're on the same page, just like before, I have the positive lead on the multimeter connected to 12 volts, and if I ground this probe, it'll show 12 volts on the meter, like so.
DC 12.74 volt.
Some people use test lights. I use this goofy and annoying talking multimeter when I'm troubleshooting. Now, if I probe this contact in the relay socket, we get nothing, and that's fine. However, when I switch the ignition on, that's when we should see voltage on the meter, and that's because the pin we're looking at should go to ground when the ECM switches it. Let's see if that's true. And nothing, so that's not good. And yeah, off camera I checked this a dozen times and still nothing. So that means this wire from the ECU to the relay socket is damaged. So we figured out what the problem is. Now we need to actually find the broken wire, but not today. My time is pretty much up. Anyway, let's take this car for a quick test drive and make sure there aren't any huge problems with it. So for now, we're going to use the jumper wire to get the fuel pump to work, and for the starter, we're going to go ahead and use the Lone Wolf 2000. Ticky, ticky, ticky. Yeah, that's annoying, but the good news is it's not coming from the engine. For some reason, the hood is ticking from the vibrations of the engine. If I press down on the hood, the noise goes away. Well, so far so good. The clutch feels fantastic, which is great news. Actually, the electric power steering even works. I guess I wasn't even expecting that, although I could live without it. The brakes are a bit noisy, and there may be some rust on the rotors. They seem to work okay. So obviously the hybrid system isn't working, otherwise we'd have an additional 13 horsepower and a bunch of extra torque when the car accelerates. So the car ain't fast, but it ain't slow either. Actually, it's faster than the diesel-powered Insight. Go figure. Anyway, these cars came with either a 5-speed manual transmission or a CVT transmission. Obviously, this car has the desirable manual transmission, and it feels good. The ratios for this transmission are definitely not performance-oriented and are better suited for fuel economy. Yep, the brakes are a bit noisy, and I'll need to take a look at them, but not today. So this car has air conditioning, and that's a nice feature to have. The fuel economy on something like this ranges between 50 to 70 miles per US gallon. I guess it depends on driving styles and traffic. If the hybrid system was functional, well, that actually improves the fuel economy for city driving. However, the hybrid assist has very little effect for highway driving. So a non-functional hybrid system still means this car would get great fuel economy on the expressway. You know, this car drives great for being off the road for the last several years. Yeah, it's got some problems here and there, but overall it feels very solid, especially for having 250,000 miles on the odometer. I have no way of checking, but there's a good chance this car was maintained up to the point the fuel lines failed. So what's the value of something like this? Well, considering it's a 24-year-old Japanese car with a 5-speed manual transmission and it has no rust, you would think something like this would sell for a small fortune. But no. I think for most people, these cars are way too complex, and that's a shame. If you look hard enough, you can find similar cars for under $1,000. There's a cult following for these rare cars, and even a dedicated website to help with the technical problems. So a lot of these cars are actually still on the road, but you also have to consider the other potential use for these cars, and that is, they're perfect for building an insanely fast little street machine. Yeah, the guy I bought this from also had another insight, and his good car had a turbocharged 2.4-liter engine in it, or in other words, a K-swap. This car is amazing, and the engine swap is so clean. Now, if the giant engine wasn't insane enough, this car also has air conditioning. Well, sort of. The compressor is mounted to the engine, and the car is waiting for a few custom high-pressure hoses to complete the AC installation. So, the crazy thing is, a K-swap Insight with a turbo can easily make 400 to 500 horsepower. Now that's a lot of power for such a lightweight car. Now, as much as I love this K-swap Insight, I'm thinking it's a bit much. I feel like this car has a lot more to give with its little 1-liter 67 horsepower engine. And when you factor in the incredible fuel economy, this would be a great butt hauler. So I'm thinking I'm going to keep this one, and the fact that the hybrid garbage doesn't work doesn't bother me at all. Now, I'm aware replacement batteries are available, but the expense of replacing the battery offsets any money that's actually saved if the car is used with the gasoline engine only. The hybrid system appeals to some people, but not to me, especially if it's going to cost a lot of money to fix it. Well, we still have a handful of issues to work out with the fuel pump and the starter, but that doesn't scare me. I kind of like the challenge. But that's going to have to wait for another Saturday afternoon. For now, the car will have to go on the back burner until I have time to play with it again. Anyway, I have a supercharger to install on the other Insight, so it's time to get going on that. Until next time.